After nearly 30 years on death row, Thomas Lee Gudinas was executed at 6:02 p.m. on June 24, 2025, at Florida State Prison. The sentence was for the 1994 killing of 24-year-old Michelle McGrath. He was 20 when he committed the crime and 51 when executed. The story that haunted Florida had finally reached its end. For the witnesses, it ended quickly, but the story that brought him here ran far deeper. Early life plus psychological fracture. Thomas Lee Gudinas was born in 1974 and raised in a home that, by most accounts, offered little stability. There are few public details about his early years, but the picture that emerges from court filings and appeals is one of a deeply troubled young man. His attorneys would later describe signs of severe mental illness, episodes of paranoia, emotional detachment, and an inability to connect with reality. Teachers and neighbors remembered odd behavior, escalating aggression, and long silences that felt heavy even in childhood. By his late teens, Gudinas was drifting. No steady work, no school, and no meaningful support system. The psychiatric assessments that came later didn't excuse what he would do, but they pointed to something broken long before the crime. A mind unraveling, a fuse already lit. And on a humid spring night in downtown Orlando, it finally went off. The crime. On the night of May 16, 1994, Michelle McGrath went out with friends to Barbarella's, a nightclub in downtown Orlando. She was 24 years old, young, full of life, and just beginning her career in the city. As the night wound down, she said goodbye to her friends and left the club alone around 2:45 a.m. She never made it home. Outside the club, Thomas Gudinas was already lurking. Witnesses later reported seeing him following multiple women that evening, staring, circling, then retreating. One woman said he chased her down a nearby street earlier that night, stopping only when she screamed and managed to escape. Another witness, a school janitor arriving early for his morning shift, saw a man matching Gudinas' description trailing Michelle as she walked along the sidewalk. No one intervened. No one knew how quickly things would turn. Just a few blocks from the club, Michelle was attacked. Investigators later pieced together the scene. She had been pushed into an alley next to a school. What happened there was violent and prolonged. She suffered multiple blows to the head and severe trauma. She was also sexually assaulted. Her body was left in the alley, partially unclothed, surrounded by signs of a struggle. The area was dark, isolated, and silent. By the time her body was discovered the next morning, by the same school employee who had seen her walking hours earlier, Gudinas was already gone. The forensic evidence left behind told its own story. DNA from the scene later matched Gudinas. Police also found his fingerprints nearby and shoe prints consistent with his sneakers. Security footage from outside the club showed him loitering around closing time. Several witnesses were able to positively identify him in a lineup, including the woman he had chased earlier that night. But more than the evidence, it was the brutality and randomness of the crime that shook the city. Michelle hadn't known Gudinas. She wasn't targeted because of a feud or relationship. She was simply alone, walking home, when she crossed paths with someone who had been spiraling for years. The investigation moved quickly. As the public reacted in horror, Orlando police were already building their case. And less than a week after the attack, they found the man they were looking for. The manhunt plus arrest. Thomas Gudinas didn't stay hidden for long. Within days of Michelle McGrath's death, Orlando police had collected enough leads to zero in on him. Witnesses had seen him near the club, and one woman reported being followed and threatened by a man matching his description earlier that same night. The school employee who discovered Michelle's body also remembered seeing someone trailing her hours before. Those accounts helped sketch a timeline, and Gudinas's presence stood out in all of it. Detectives soon linked him to the scene through physical evidence. His fingerprints and shoe impressions matched what investigators found in the alley, and DNA testing supported the growing case against him. When officers located Gudinas, he was calm, too calm according to reports. He didn't resist arrest, and though he didn't confess outright, his statements raised concerns about his mental state. The timeline from the crime to his capture was swift, just 6 days. But in that short window, the damage was already done, and the case against him was already starting to take shape. What came next would confirm just how serious the state of Florida was about seeking the harshest possible punishment. Trial plus sentencing. The trial of Thomas Lee Gudinas began in early 1995, less than a year after the crime. Prosecutors built their case on a combination of forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the timeline that placed Gudinas near Michelle McGrath in the final minutes of her life. Jurors heard from women who said Gudinas had followed or approached them that night, including one who narrowly escaped. The picture painted in court was of a man roaming the streets in search of someone vulnerable and finding her. Gudinas's defense focused heavily on his mental health. His attorneys argued that he was not fully aware of his actions, citing long-standing signs of psychological instability. But the jury wasn't swayed. After a relatively short deliberation, they returned a recommendation of death by a vote of 10-2. On June 16, 1995, a judge formally sentenced him to death. The reaction from the public was swift and emotional. For many in Orlando, Michelle's death had become a symbol of fear, of the dangers that could be waiting even in familiar places. The sentence offered a sense of finality, but not closure. The brutality of the case, combined with Gudinas' lack of remorse, left a lasting impression on the community. And while the legal process had moved quickly, the next stage, appeals, reviews, and delays, would stretch on for decades, dragging the case into the slow machinery of death row justice. Mental health, appeals, and final warrant. In the years following his sentencing, Thomas Gudinas' legal team pursued every possible avenue of appeal. Most of their efforts centered on one issue: his mental health. Attorneys presented evaluations suggesting Gudinas suffered from long-standing psychological disorders, including symptoms of delusion and emotional disconnection. They argued that executing someone in that condition would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. But over the decades, each appeal was denied. Courts consistently upheld the original sentence, ruling that his condition did not meet the threshold required to halt execution. By 2025, nearly 30 years after the crime, the final chapter began. On May 23, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Gudinas' death warrant, scheduling the execution for June 24. The announcement reignited debate over the death penalty, especially in cases involving mental illness. His attorneys filed an emergency petition to the Florida Supreme Court, again citing mental health concerns. But in early June, the court issued a short ruling. The execution would proceed. There would be no further delays. As the clock ticked down, Gudinas was moved to the death watch cell, a quiet space just steps away from the execution chamber. The appeals were over. The sentence, decades old, was finally set to be carried out. What remained was the wait, a final day behind locked doors, and then the moment that would bring it all to a close. Final 24 hours. In the final hours of June 24, 2025, Thomas Lee Gudinas remained alone in a small concrete cell known as the Death Watch. Just feet from the execution chamber, the space is designed for silence and separation. He was under constant observation, surrounded by guards trained to say little and watch closely. A chaplain was made available, as is custom, and a spiritual advisor reportedly visited at least once during the day. Gudinas didn't speak much. He had stopped fighting long before the end. He was offered a final meal, but records show he barely touched it. Officials do not always release the details of what an inmate orders, and in Gudinas' case, nothing unusual was reported. There were no last-minute legal filings, no media interviews, no public statement. Visitors are allowed for death row inmates in the final hours, but it's unclear if anyone came. At 6 p.m., the curtains were drawn back. Behind the glass, journalists, victims' relatives, and state officials sat quietly. Inside the chamber, Gudinas was strapped to a padded gurney. He stared at the ceiling as medical staff administered the lethal injection. The process is clinical. No noise, no struggle. Just the stillness of a room built for endings. At 6:02 p.m., the drugs began to flow. Less than 10 minutes later, the warden confirmed what the state had waited 3 decades to hear. The sentence had been carried out, and Thomas Lee Gudinas was pronounced dead.